The sound of the iron door closing behind me echoed like an invisible sentence, heavily weighing down my soul. Each day spent within these four cold walls was like an endless loop. Outside, the sunlight still shone, but inside where I sat, a thick darkness enveloped me. In prison, time lost its meaning. Day and night blended, leaving only the sound of guards' footsteps, the clanging of metal, and the heavy breaths of people who had lost their freedom. I was one of them, a person filled with bitterness, hatred, and wounds from the past. I remembered the disappointed looks of my family, the humiliation of being abandoned by society, and most of all, the terrible emptiness in my soul. Whenever I closed my eyes, old memories rushed back like a flood. The times I had fallen, the actions I could never forgive myself for. I remembered the disappointed looks of my family, the humiliation of being abandoned by society, and most of all, the terrible emptiness in my soul. I thought that toughness and violence would help me survive, but in reality, they only made me a prisoner twice over. Once confined by iron bars, and once confined within my own heart. On long nights, I lay on the cold iron bed, listening to the wind whistling through the small crack in the door. I felt like a ghost, alive but not truly living. I asked myself, why did my life turn out like this? Is this the end I deserve? In prison, it's easy to nurture hatred. I saw many people become more and more hardened, using violence to hide their fear. I was once like that, living with a hard shell, not letting anyone touch the wounds inside. But the more I tried to appear strong, the more exhausted I became. Inside, I longed to be free, but I didn't know where to find the way out. The darkness behind the bars was not just a space lacking light, but also the darkness of the soul, where hope was suffocated, where sinful memories surrounded me. I felt as if I had been sentenced for life, not by a human court, but by the judgment of my own conscience. Occasionally, I heard people talk about change, about light, and true freedom. But in my heart, those words seemed distant, vague, not meant for a person as steeped in sin as I was. I believed my life had ended long ago. However, I didn't know that even in that darkness, a ray of light was quietly searching for me. A ray of light that no iron bar could stop. But at that time, I was still blind, only knowing how to live with my pain, waiting for another meaningless day to pass. In the silence, all I could hear was the beating of my own heart, heavy, chaotic, and filled with silent cries that no one could hear. I didn't know that there was a God who was listening to it all, even in the darkest prison of my life. There are some decisions in life that you can't turn back from. I often thought that if I had gone a different way that day, maybe my life wouldn't have fallen into such a deep abyss. But my destiny, or rather, the wrong choices I made with my own hands, led me to the cold iron door of this prison. It all started with small cracks in my soul. In my reckless youth, I believed I was wise enough to decide everything for myself. I chose my friends, my way of life, and parties that had no end. The alcohol, the cigarette smoke, and the times I proved my mettle made me think I was strong. But in reality, it was just a way for me to escape the emptiness inside. Then I stumbled. At first, it was just testing the limits. A fight, a shady deal to get quick money. I told myself, just this one time. But that one time led to a series of next times, and I slid further down. When you step onto the path of sin, it's like a slippery slope. The more you try to stop, the more you realize you don't have the strength. There was a night I remember so clearly. It was pouring rain, and a few friends and I planned a robbery. Deep down, I knew it was wrong, but my arrogance and greed overshadowed my conscience. I thought, if it's successful, everything will change. But life never works according to human calculations. The plan failed, and I was arrested. The day I stood before the judge, I listened to the sentence being pronounced, and my heart went numb. All eyes were on me. The disappointed eyes of my family, the contemptuous eyes of society, and my own bitter eyes when I looked in the mirror. I was no longer myself. I remember my mother's face that day. She didn't cry. She just sat silently, her eyes red. Her pain was like a knife stabbing me in the heart. All the years she sacrificed to raise me, now she was repaid with shame and disgrace. I was the ungrateful son who had shattered every hope. In the first days of prison, I lived with constant torment. Every morning I opened my eyes, I had to face the four cold walls and the reality that I was a criminal. I tried to be tough, but at night, when the lights were off, tears would flow. I asked myself, how did I end up like this? What did I lose along the way? I began to remember every step that had led me here. The mistakes didn't happen in a day. They were nurtured little by little by my stubbornness, my ego, and my disregard for my parents' teachings. I wanted to decide my life without God, without anyone. I pushed myself off the path of light and into the darkness. In prison, people call the sentence the price to pay. But for me, it was not just a legal sentence. It was a sentence in my conscience. I was not only chained by iron bars, but also bound by guilt, regret, and self-hatred. Some nights I wished I could turn back time to stop my own steps. But the truth is, no one can go back to the past. The sin had happened, the sentence was set, and I had to live with the consequences. However, deep down, I still longed for something. A chance to start over, to be forgiven. Small and fragile as it was, that flame of hope had never completely gone out. I didn't know where to look, but in my heart, there was a strange voice. This is not the end. It was that voice, vague but persistent, that kept me alive through the darkest days. Although bound by my sentence, I began to feel an invisible hand waiting to pull me out of the abyss. But at that time, I didn't know it was the hand of God. The iron door closed behind me, leaving a cold echo that resonated in the cramped space. In that moment, I clearly felt that I had been separated from the world. There was no light, no sound except for my own gasping breath and the frantic pounding of my heart in my chest. I had once thought I was used to loneliness, but the loneliness in solitary confinement was completely different. It was like a swallowing abyss, making me lose all sense of time and space. The four cold walls seemed to be closing in, suffocating every breath. The darkness was so thick I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. I reached out, trying to find a foothold, but only touched the damp, rough surface of the wall. The fear didn't come immediately. It crept in, seeping, gnawing at every small piece of my mind. At first, I tried to keep myself busy, counting every second, humming old songs, trying to think of happy memories. But gradually, my mind became chaotic. My heartbeat became the only sound echoing in the room. It pounded, insistent, as if reminding me that I was still alive, but abandoned, completely meaningless. Day or night, I didn't know. Light never penetrated this place, only darkness. I could hear even the smallest sounds. A drop of water falling from the ceiling, the sound of an insect somewhere in the hallway, and the soft whistle of the wind through the crack in the door. But it was the silence between those sounds that was more terrifying than anything else. It seemed to be whispering in my ear, "You have nothing left, only nothingness." Fear began to transform into images in my head. I imagined I would die here, and no one would know, no one would remember. My body would be forgotten, as if I had never existed. I saw my lost self in the room, then it disappeared into thin air. Sometimes I screamed. I punched the wall until my hands bled. I begged someone, anyone, to open that door, but no one answered. The room remained silent, like a closed tomb. I started talking to myself. Then I laughed, I cried, and I trembled. My mind felt like it was going to explode. I thought about death more than ever. In this place, death was no longer a stranger. It seemed like the only door to escape. However, in that despair, there was a strange moment. When my tears had run out and my screams had no more strength, I sat down on the floor, pressing my head against the cold wall. I listened to my heartbeat. It was still beating. Every beat, despite the darkness. In the profound silence, I suddenly realized something was still keeping me alive. Some invisible hand had not allowed me to end it all. I didn't know what it was. But in the solitary confinement room, in the midst of thick darkness, a tiny ray of light flickered in my heart. Fragile, but enough to make me wonder, was I really abandoned? Or was there still a God watching over me, waiting for me to call out to him? On some dark nights, the silence became a kind of invisible shackle. In the cold room, I heard a sound that didn't come from the outside, but from deep within my own soul. A gentle, persistent whisper, like an underground stream eroding a rock face. Everything is over. There's nothing left to hold on to. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion, but the more I tried to push it away, the clearer the voice became. It wasn't loud or violent, but soft, like a cunning whisper trying to seduce me. It reminded me of failures, humiliations, and tears I had tried to hide. It combined them into a gloomy melody, repeating until the hope in me gradually ran out. In my mind, a dead-end road appeared. I was like a lost person, constantly hitting the wall in front of me, and the more I tried to find a way out, the more painful it became. I began to believe that maybe death was the final door, the only escape from the endless torment. I remember the moments I used to smile in front of others, trying to hide the brokenness inside. But when night came, loneliness rushed in, enveloping me like a thick fog, suffocating me. It was on those nights that the whisper became stronger. It poured a seemingly logical reasoning into my ear, that if I ended it now, I would no longer be in pain, that everyone would just forget me anyway, that my presence wouldn't change anything in this world. I began to argue with myself. A part of me wanted to live, to believe that tomorrow could be better. But the other part, the part occupied by darkness, kept whispering, "Don't lie to yourself anymore. It's all over." The battle in my soul was more fierce than any battle outside. I was both the condemned and the judge who sentenced myself. Sometimes I sat motionless for hours, staring into space, letting the dark thoughts carry me away. I felt as if an invisible hand was pulling me down into an abyss. Beneath it was emptiness, but strangely, I was attracted to it. In that moment of weakness, I imagined ending it all. The image was no longer foreign, but appeared as a viable option. The fear of death was gradually replaced by the temptation of release. I trembled as I realized I was standing on a fragile line between life and death. However, right in the middle of that inner storm, something strange happened. When the whisper of despair was at its strongest, I heard another whisper, so small and gentle that I almost missed it. This voice did not deny my pain, but brought a reminder. You are still loved. You are not alone. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, but that whisper did not disappear. It patiently crept through the layers of gloom, not forceful, not rushed. Like a tiny ray of light piercing a crack in a stone wall, it made me stop abruptly. No longer daring to rush into the darkness as before. That struggle went on. On one side was the call of despair, urging me to end it all. On the other was the whisper of hope, fragile but true, holding me back from the brink. I realized that life and death were only separated by one decision. But that decision did not only concern me, but also the people who loved me, and a God whom I had never truly sought, but who was always watching over me. That night, I did not make a final decision. I just sat there trembling, letting both whispers echo in my heart. I was not strong enough to believe in life, but I was not desperate enough to end it. And it was in that limbo that I understood I still had a chance, a fragile thread that kept me from falling into the abyss. The whisper of despair was still there, but now it no longer consumed my mind. Because parallel to it, I began to hear another invitation, gentle, patient, and full of love. Even though I didn't fully understand, deep down, I knew it was the beginning of a new journey where darkness was no longer the only voice. In the four cold walls of the prison, I often rummaged through the odds and ends that others had left behind. Mostly just a few scraps of paper, pens that had run out of ink, or a half-torn notebook. But one day, while tidying up the rickety wooden shelf near my bed, my hand accidentally touched a book with a worn spine, peeling hardback cover, and yellowed pages from age. The words Holy Bible were faintly printed on the cover. I picked it up, feeling a bit of curiosity. No one knew where it came from. Maybe a volunteer pastor had left it after a visit, or maybe a former inmate had forgotten it. In a place where everything was scarce, a complete book like this was a real treasure. I remember the moment I turned the first page. The paper was so thin it felt like it would tear. It smelled of old age, and the words were printed close together, both strange and somehow solemn. At first, I just intended to read it out of boredom. Here, time stretched on endlessly. Day after day was just eating, working, sleeping, and repeating. A book, no matter what it was enough to kill a few hours. I never thought that this Bible could touch the depths of my heart. I opened it randomly and landed on the book of Psalms. The words resonated like a whisper in the night. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. I laughed, thinking, who would believe that? If he were really with me, why would I be in this prison? Why would I have to live in filth, sin, and despair? But strangely, even though my mouth was skeptical, I continued to read. At night, when the dim yellow light from the prison shone down, I sat huddled on my iron bed, turning the fragile pages. There were parts I didn't understand at all, filled with strange names and ancient laws. But then occasionally, a short sentence would pierce the hardened shell in my heart. I remember most the part where Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." My heart sank. Wasn't I the weary and burdened one? Weary from sin, from the heavy sentence, from the long nights with no future in sight. Rest, those two words were like an oasis in the desert, making me both yearn and doubt. I asked myself, could these words be for a person like me? An inmate? A person who was once lost, who once wanted to end his life? In the days that followed, I carried the Bible with me like a talisman. Not because I believed immediately, but because there was something in it that I couldn't walk away from. I read it before I slept, read it while waiting for work time, and even read it silently in my heart when I heard the guards yelling in the yard. Gradually, I realized the old Bible was no longer just an old book. It was like a mirror, forcing me to confront myself, the mistakes, the sins, the wounds I had hidden for so long. It was also like a door, opening up for me to see another world, a world of forgiveness, of unconditional love, of hope that was still there, even after all the devastation. One night when the whole room was fast asleep, I sat quietly in the flickering light. I read the verse again. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him." My heart suddenly trembled. Was it him knocking on the door of my heart right now through these old pages? I wasn't brave enough to open it completely, but for the first time, I no longer wanted to keep it shut. That old Bible became my companion during my months in prison. It didn't change the circumstances immediately. The walls were still walls, the chains were still chains. But deep in my heart, a small seed had been planted. I didn't know when it would sprout, but I believed that somewhere there was a God who was silently waiting for me to open my heart so he could step in. From a simple curiosity, I began a journey to find meaning, to find a God whose face I had never seen but who seemed to know every dark corner of my life. And it all started with an old Bible. I still remember that fateful night when death seemed like the only option. Everything in me felt like it was closing in, like a cramped room with no window to breathe through. I sat there, my hands trembling, my heart heavy, and only one thought echoing in my mind. Just end it. This is enough. But in the midst of that despair, something strange happened. Amidst the suffocating silence, Bible verses suddenly echoed in my mind, clear, powerful, like a call from a distant place that went straight to my soul. I didn't understand why I remembered them. Maybe it was from when I was a child, hearing my mother read them on family nights. Or maybe it was God himself coming to find me in the moment I was about to lose my life. The first verse that came was, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." Hebrews 13:5. I stopped, my eyes blurred with tears. In the middle of the dark room, that verse was like a small lamp, illuminating the thick darkness. I once believed I was alone, that no one cared about my existence anymore. But right there, in that extreme moment, there was a God confirming that he had never abandoned me. Then, like an overflowing stream, other words came. "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." Eternal life, those two words stunned me. While I was thinking about death, he reminded me of life. While I thought death would free me, he showed me that only life in him could truly set me free. I burst into tears. This time it wasn't the tears of despair, but the tears of someone who was beginning to see the light pierce through the night. I remembered all the times I had rejected God, all the times I had lived as if He didn't exist, and yet now, when I was at the edge of the abyss, He still came to me with living words as if to pull me from the arms of death. I trembled and prayed, even though the prayer was clumsy and broken. Lord, if you are truly still here, please save me. I can't get out on my own anymore. As soon as I said that, I felt something I had never experienced before. It was as if a gentle yet firm power was enveloping me. It wasn't an explosive miracle, not thunder or a strange light, but a quiet peace, a subtle but certain stillness. In my heart, the thought of dying gradually faded, replaced by a glimmer of hope, small but truly present. I understood. It was God's word that held me back. It was those Bible verses, which seemed like old words, that became the rope that pulled me back from the abyss. From that moment, I realized that the Bible was not just a book, but a living word in the midst of death. When my soul was withered, when my heart was closed, His word still pierced through, reaching the deepest part of me. Many days later, I still remember that feeling. I began to open the Bible again, the book that had been forgotten in the corner of the shelf for a long time. Each page was like a drop of water on the dry desert of my heart. I read slowly, not to study, not to prove anything, but to survive. And I truly felt like I was being reborn little by little. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light for my path. Psalm 119, 5. This verse became my companion every night. It reminded me that I no longer had to grope in the dark, because His light was still shining. Even if it was just a small step, it was enough for me to keep going. I realized the death I once sought was not an escape, but only an escape. But the life God gave me, even though I didn't fully understand it, didn't fully grasp it, was a true promise of freedom. That day I chose to live, not because I was strong, but because His word was stronger than death. That night, the thick darkness seemed to swallow the entire cramped cell. There were no more footsteps of guards, no more screams of fellow inmates, only a chilling silence. I sat huddled on the torn mat, my back against the damp, moldy wall, my heart pounding in my chest. Never had I felt so alone and exposed. In the grip of fear, a thought suddenly flashed. If there is a God who is truly listening, could He save me? I had never prayed before. Or rather, I had never believed that prayer meant anything. Since I was little, I was used to relying on my own strength, fighting life with my will and cunning. But now, within these four walls, all that strength became useless. I trembled and clasped my hands together, not knowing how to begin. My rough fingers intertwined, and cold sweat broke out. Words came out of my mouth, hesitant and clumsy. God, if you are truly real, please hear me. I don't know what to say, and I don't know if I'm worthy. But I'm so scared. I'm so tired. I have no one left to lean on. If you can, please don't abandon me. I stopped, listening. But there was nothing but the loud thumping of my own heart. The room was still pitch black. No light from the ceiling, no strange voice. But strangely, as soon as that prayer left my lips, I felt a gentle warmth spread through my chest. It didn't erase all the fear or take away the prison cell, but it was like a small spark that had just ignited in the darkness. I whispered again, this time with all sincerity, please just be here with me. I don't need much, just for you to be here. My tears fell, hot on my cheeks. For so many years I had held back my tears, lived as someone who never allowed himself to be weak. But now I cried. I cried not just out of fear, but because, for the first time in my life, I dared to expose my true self to an invisible God. Memories from the past suddenly rushed back. I remembered my childhood, when I walked past a church and heard the bells ring, and my heart would wonder, is God really in there? I remembered the kind old neighbor who would always say, pray, child, God listens to everything. I had laughed, thinking it was just empty comfort, but now in this darkness, I saw myself as that child again. Fragile, small, just hoping for a bigger hand to hold. Praying for the first time, I didn't know what to say. I just whispered the same sentence over and over, please don't abandon me. Those words echoed in the empty room, but in my heart, they seemed to be traveling into an infinite space, reaching somewhere beyond the stone walls. I don't know how long I sat there. My eyes were heavy and the tears had dried on my cheeks. Before I fell asleep, I felt a strange sense of peace. Not peace because my circumstances had changed, but peace because I knew I had just been heard. For the first time in many days of confinement, I slept a deep sleep without nightmares. The next morning, when the sunlight shone through the narrow crack, I sat up with a different feeling. I couldn't explain it, but it seemed as if a dark corner of my heart had been lit up. Small as it was, that light was enough for me to continue through a new day. That night opened up something I had never had in my life. I had learned to pray. It was not just a plea in despair, but the moment I first believed that I was not alone. And from that moment, the journey to meet the God I once doubted began. I remember that moment so clearly. The moment when darkness seemed to have consumed everything. The four walls around me seemed to narrow, suffocating and cold. In my heart, all hope seemed to have died. Every day I woke up just to feel the shackles of sin, failure, and fear tightening their grip on me once more. I was like an invisible prisoner, locked in my own mind and heart. But right then, something strange happened. In the midst of the heavy atmosphere, I suddenly felt a gentleness, like a light breeze blowing through the dark room. It didn't come with a sound, nor did it appear as a clear image. It was like a soft touch, not on my skin, but deep in the core of my soul. It was the soft touch of grace. At first I was skeptical. I wondered if I was imagining things, or if my weak mind was creating a false feeling to distract me from the pain. But the more I tried to deny it, the more I felt that peace clearly. It was like cool water seeping into a parched land, soothing the long-standing cracks in my soul. I no longer heard the accusations that tormented me day and night. You're useless. You're a failure. You don't deserve to live anymore. Instead, I heard another voice, soft but strong. You are not abandoned. I am with you. Just one sentence, but it was enough to shatter the layer of ice that surrounded my heart. Tears flowed, not from pain, but because I never expected that in this dark place, he still saw me. I began to believe that I was not completely alone, that there was still a God who cared about my survival, even though I had once rejected him. The feeling was like a prisoner who had lived in a closed cellar for a long time, and suddenly saw a small crack of light pierce through the thick wall. That light was not enough to set me free, but it was enough to affirm there is a vast world out there, and I can be let out of here. From that moment on, I no longer looked at life with the same eyes of despair. I was not yet free from captivity. There were still many chains, and fear still surrounded me. But deep within me, there was a small light that could not be extinguished. I knew it wasn't my own strength, but a gift, a grace. Grace is not loud. It comes gently, like a hand placed on your shoulder when you are trembling in the dark. It doesn't change the circumstances instantly, but it changes how you look at the circumstances. It doesn't promise that the door will open wide tomorrow, but it guarantees that you don't have to walk alone. And I realized what I needed was not a quick escape route, but a God to walk with me on the journey. In the following days, I began to whisper prayers. At first, they were hesitant and clumsy, like a child learning to talk. I didn't ask for wealth, fame, or anything grand. I just said, Lord, if you are truly here, please don't leave me. The strange thing was, every time I said that sentence, I felt a heavy layer in my heart being lifted. I slept easier, no longer haunted by dark dreams as before. I woke up not to complain, but to wait to see what he would do in me today. Perhaps outsiders wouldn't see any change, but in my inner world, a revolution had begun. I was learning to believe that grace is not just for the holy, but also for the fallen, the sinful, and the failures, like me. When I think back, I find it so miraculous that grace didn't come like a storm, but like a gentle touch. But that very gentleness was enough to wake me from spiritual death, to make me realize that life was still possible. And I understood that from that moment, my journey had entered a new chapter, a chapter where darkness was no longer the final word. In the first days in prison, my heart was filled with bitterness. I was angry with myself for letting my life spiral down to this point. I was angry with the people who had hurt me and angry with those who had betrayed my trust. Every night, when the sound of the lock echoed, I would lie on the hard mat, my eyes wide open in the dark, and my heart would be filled with endless questions. Why did they treat me like that? Why is life so unfair? Those questions never had an answer, only leaving a large void in my soul, filled with hatred and self-blame. I thought that if I were ever free, I would find a way to get revenge. That thought was like a fire that fueled me through those dark months. However, God began to touch my heart in a way I didn't expect. One morning, as the sunlight seeped through the iron bars, I heard a fellow inmate whispering from the Bible. At first, I was annoyed, because those words seemed to remind me of something foreign, something that didn't belong in this place of darkness. But for some reason, the words echoed in my mind all day. Forgive your enemies, as your Father in heaven has forgiven you. I shook my head, thinking this was impossible. How could I forgive the people who had put me in this prison? How could I forgive myself for destroying everything I once had? But then, that night, as I lay listening to the sound of rain on the tin roof, my heart suddenly sank. I realized that it was this bitterness that was the real chain binding me, not the cold prison walls. From that day on, I started to listen more to the Bible verses that my fellow inmates shared. I didn't say anything, but inside there was a fierce struggle. On one side was the call for revenge. On the other was the gentle whisper of forgiveness. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads. One side was the old path of hatred. The other was a new path that I had never dared to take. Then one evening, during our group prayer, I burst into tears. The tears fell not out of pain, but because I saw that I had held on to so much hatred for so long. I said in my heart, Lord, I don't know how to forgive. Please teach me. If you can forgive me, a person who was lost, then please give me the strength to forgive too. From that moment, a heavy burden seemed to fall from my shoulders. I began to learn to see the people who had hurt me not as enemies, but as human beings who were also filled with wounds, just like me. I remembered their fearful eyes, their unfounded anger, and I realized they were also just lost souls possessed by darkness. Forgiveness did not come immediately, nor was it an easy feeling. There were nights when I was still haunted by old memories, and there were days when I still wanted to scream in frustration. But every time that happened, I would kneel in silence and whisper to myself, I forgive, because you have forgiven me. Gradually, I noticed a change. The tension in my face eased, and sleep came more easily. My conversations with fellow inmates were no longer filled with bitterness, but with empathy instead. I was even more surprised when one day I proactively took the hand of a man who had made me angry in the prison and said to him, I'm not angry with you anymore. In that moment, I knew God was doing a miracle in my heart. I understood that forgiveness is not about justifying a mistake, but about setting yourself free. When I forgave, I stepped out of the invisible prison of hatred to live in the freedom that God gave me. The bitterness of the past gradually turned into compassion. I began to pray for the people who had harmed me, and even for those who had never realized they also needed the grace of forgiveness. I prayed for myself to never return to my old self. One morning, as I watched the sunlight stream through the iron bars, I smiled. I realized that this prison was no longer a prison for my soul. I had been freed from within. I had found an unprecedented peace, a peace that only comes when the heart knows how to forgive. In my early days in prison, I once thought my life had completely ended. Every morning, the cold clang of the alarm, the dry clatter of iron chains, the musty smell clinging to the corner of the wall, all gave me the feeling of living in a mass grave. I was used to the darkness, but now I had to learn to get used to the hopeless silence as well. However, in the midst of that heavy atmosphere, a new hope arose in my heart. Since I met God, my heart no longer only knew suffering. I began to find meaning in every small moment, even in places that seemed to have no light left. One day, as I was slumped in a corner, I whispered a prayer. The prayer was short but profound. Lord, please use me even in this prison. I didn't expect him to answer so quickly. In my cell, there was an inmate named Hoa. He was a tough guy, known for being reckless and never believing in anything but the power of his fists. One time when he saw me mumbling a prayer, he laughed. "Hey, who are you talking to? Nobody hears you here." I looked up and smiled gently. "I'm talking to God, and I believe He hears no matter where I am, even behind these bars." His eyes were filled with surprise. Perhaps it was the first time he had heard someone talk about a God who could be present in the darkest of places. From that day on, whenever night fell, Hoa would sit closer to me. At first, he would just listen secretly, but then he started talking. "The God you talk about, does He really care about people like me? I've caused too much trouble." I looked at him, seeing the tremor in his seemingly tough voice. I told him about myself, someone who once wanted to end his life, someone who thought he had lost everything. But in my most desperate moments, God found me, saved me, and gave me a new life. I told him, if He didn't abandon me, then He surely won't abandon you either. Those words seemed to touch the deepest corner of Hoa's heart. He didn't say anything more, but from that day, I saw him start to change. He became less aggressive, swore less, and sometimes would quietly sit next to me during prayer time. It wasn't just Hoa. A few other inmates were also curious. They often asked, "The world outside has abandoned us. Our families no longer remember us. Why would a God care about us?" I told them the story of the merciful father who ran out to welcome his prodigal son home. I emphasized, God doesn't see you through your past sins. He sees you as a child who can be forgiven and loved. And so every evening, a few brothers and I would gather. We didn't have a complete Bible, only a few small pages we had found. But every word, every short passage became food for our souls. When we read, we shared our faith with each other, telling each other what God had done in our lives. It was strange how a place that should have been filled with gloom now echoed with a quiet song. One person would hum a melody, another would join in, and gradually the whole cell would hum simple songs to God. The guards would sometimes yell, but then they would slowly ignore it. Perhaps even they could feel that strange peace. One night, Hoa suddenly shed tears. He whispered, "I haven't cried for 10 years, but today I know God is touching me." We prayed together, and I witnessed the moment he surrendered to God's love. From then on, Hoa was no longer the reckless person he once was, but became a gentle brother, always ready to help more vulnerable inmates. That small light began to spread. One person believed, then two believed, and then a small group was formed. We called it the Church Behind the Iron Bars. There was no roof, no church bell, only broken hearts finding hope in God. I realized that a testimony doesn't need a large stage or a cheering crowd. The most authentic testimony is living differently, even in the most difficult circumstances. In the midst of those cold walls, we still found true freedom. And I knew that it was here, behind the iron bars, that my faith took deeper root than ever before. I still remember the first days after I decided to follow God. At that time, my heart felt lit up, full of joy and hope. Everything seemed to change. The sky was bluer, people were less distant, and I myself felt reborn. But that young joy didn't last long. Soon after, the days of trials began to knock. Not everyone believed my testimony. Some smiled awkwardly, others outright ridiculed me. They thought I was making things up, that it was just a hallucination of a weak person seeking comfort. Some even said, if God is real, why did he let you suffer to the point of wanting to commit suicide before he saved you? Those words were like sharp knives cutting deep into my soul. I remained silent, but my heart was in turmoil. My old friends, the ones who used to wander with me in bars and stay up all night with music, also started to distance themselves. They couldn't accept a new me, someone who was no longer drunk, no longer impulsively seeking joy in short-term pleasures. They laughed at me, calling me a fake saint and a hypocrite. Every time I heard it, I felt both sad and suffocatingly lonely. Sometimes I would ask myself, am I delusional? Did God really save me, or is it all just my imagination to fill the void? On top of that, temptations constantly surrounded me. The old life didn't let go easily. Bad habits, old ways of living, and the doors that once led me into darkness all appeared one by one to try and pull me back. Once, after a tired and stressful day, I stood at the door of my familiar bar. The yellow light and the sounds of laughter seemed like a hand pulling me in. I almost stepped inside, but in that moment a whisper echoed in my heart. "You have been set free. Why are you going back to chains?" I stepped back, tears falling, knowing that he was still there, holding me. But the trials didn't just come from the outside. In my heart, my faith was still young and easily swayed by storms. There were nights I lay awake, wondering if I was truly forgiven. I remembered my past, the mistakes I had made, and fear arose. What if this is all a beautiful dream, and when I wake up, I'll still be the same old sinner? It was on nights like these that I prayed through my tears. And gradually, I learned one thing. Faith isn't about not having doubts, but about holding on to God even when doubts surround you. The days of trials also taught me patience. I realized that following God doesn't mean all difficulties immediately disappear. On the contrary, sometimes trials even increase, as if to train my faith to mature. Just as gold is refined in fire, my soul needed to go through hardship to become firm. I gradually learned to be grateful even for the ridicule, because it forced me to turn back and lean on Him. I also learned to be grateful for the temptations, because they helped me realize my own weakness and need God even more. I remember once, when a family member strongly opposed my faith, I was in immense pain. They thought I was deluded, deceived by a strange religion. I wanted to explain, to prove it with logic, but every word was useless. In that helplessness, I knelt and prayed. And for the first time, I understood the power of silence and patience. Instead of trying to prove it, I let my life be the testimony. I believed that time and love would speak for me. And so, day after day, the trials came and went. There were times I stumbled, times I felt like giving up, but God's hand never left me. In the darkest moments, He reminded me, "Be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." I clung to that promise like an anchor in a stormy sea. Now looking back, I understand that the days of trials were not meant to destroy me, but to shape me. They made my faith more than just a fleeting emotion, but a deep and solid foundation. Without the doubts, the ridicule, the temptations, and the struggles, I might not have known how much I needed God. It was in the refining fire that I saw He was truly my companion and support. And so, I continue to walk, no longer afraid of trials, because I know that with every step I take in the darkness, there is light from Him showing the way. Within the four cold walls of the prison, I once thought I would never find a connection warm enough to dispel the loneliness that tormented me. My family outside seemed to have left me, and the people around me all carried their own wounds and defenses. But then something unexpected happened. God brought me a new family, not of blood, but of faith. One day, the prison chaplain walked into the cell block with a kind smile. He didn't carry the usual stern look of a warden or exude pity. Instead, he looked at us as people of value, souls in need of love and restoration. I clearly remember his eyes resting on me, full of patience and gentleness, as if he believed I could still change. It wasn't just him. A small group of believers from the outside also came to visit. They didn't know me, but they dedicated their time, effort, and hearts to sit and listen to our stories. They brought worn Bibles, a few packages of cookies, and most of all, they brought a completely different atmosphere, sincerity. At first I was cautious. I had been abandoned, betrayed, and believed that no one truly cared about me. I was afraid that this was just a temporary act of pity. But then, when they began to sing simple hymns, their voices imperfect but sincere, my heart was suddenly moved. The words about God's love echoed in the old room, and I felt something I had been longing for a long time, a sense of belonging. After the first meeting, I was invited to join a small group in the prison. There we read the Bible together, shared our fears, our mistakes, and even our broken dreams. No one laughed at anyone's past, and no one condemned. We sat in a circle, listened, prayed for one another, and cried together. I had never experienced anything like it. Once I told the group that I had once wanted to commit suicide, that I had thought my life was worth nothing. Another older inmate placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Brother, God has kept you alive until today. He never does anything for no reason. You're alive because He has a plan for you. I was stunned. In a place that seemed to hold only darkness, I found such honest and hopeful encouragement. Gradually, I began to realize this was the family God had given me. We were not of the same blood, but we shared the same faith. We supported each other like brothers in the same house. When one was weak, the others prayed and encouraged them. When one stumbled, the group reached out to help them stand up. The chaplain often said, "The prison can shackle your bodies, but it cannot imprison a soul that has been set free by God." That sentence was etched in my mind. I understood that even when I was not physically free, I had a new freedom in my spirit, a freedom that came from God's love and forgiveness. I also began to learn how to pray for others. Instead of just crying about my own pain, I began to lift up prayers for the brothers around me, for the one who had just lost his mother, for the one who was in despair over his long sentence, for the one who still didn't believe that God truly forgave them. When I prayed, I felt my heart expand. I was no longer a lonely person living only for myself, but a part of a community, a spiritual family. One evening after our meeting, I sat there for a long time. Looking at the faces of my brothers around me, I suddenly thought, this is the family God has placed me in. I am no longer lost. A quiet but solid joy filled my heart, a belief that I was loved, needed, and belonged. I understood that it was in these seemingly meaningless days of imprisonment that God gave me a precious gift, a new family in Him, a family that would never abandon me, because God's love was the thread that bound us together. When the inmate first came to believe in God, many thought it was just a fleeting emotional moment, a temporary weakness in the face of the darkness of the 4 prison walls. But as time went on, something strange happened. The true signs of change began to appear, not on the outside, but from deep within his soul. The person who was once known for his short temper, who would explode at just one wrong word, now knew how to be silent and restrained. The bitter words that once came so easily had gradually disappeared, replaced by a gentle, slow voice, as if he was carefully considering each word before he spoke. His fellow inmates looked at him with astonishment, and some even taunted him. "You're probably just faking being good to get your sentence reduced, right?" But time proved that the change was not an act. It was so real that the very people who once despised him began to seek him out to confide in, to ask for advice, and to pray with him. He often said, "Before I didn't believe in anything but my fists. I thought as long as I was stronger than others, I would win. But when I met God, I realized that true strength is not in power or aggression, but in love and forgiveness." Every day he spent time reading the Bible. The pages that were once so foreign became a source of light for his mind. God's word was like cool water flowing over the dry land of his heart. He began to practice prayer, no longer with selfish pleas, but with sincere words for others. He prayed for his family, the people who had suffered so much because of him. He prayed for the inmates, people like him who were once immersed in darkness. He even prayed for the people who had betrayed and harmed him. The unbelievable thing was that even the guards noticed the transformation. Before, he was always on the list of difficult-to-control inmates, but now he became someone they could trust with tasks, from cleaning to helping other prisoners. One guard once said, "If someone had told me this guy would change, I would have laughed. But now I believe there truly is a miracle." Inside him, there was no longer any bitterness. The place that once held hatred was now filled with hope. He no longer saw life as a sentence, but as a new opportunity. An opportunity to live differently, to love, to become a witness to grace. The inmate realized that true transformation doesn't come from human will. For years, he had tried to change, but failed. Only when God stepped in were all the invisible chains broken. The anger no longer dominated. The curses were no longer a habit. The darkness that once covered his heart was now dispelled by the light. And it was in that transformation that he found true freedom. A freedom that did not come from the prison door opening, but from his soul being set free. He wrote in his small notebook, "I was once a slave, not to iron chains, but to sin and darkness. But now I am a free man, free in love, in forgiveness, in hope. I died with my old self and was resurrected into a new life." From then on, he no longer wanted to hide his transformation. He began to share with anyone who was willing to listen. And the strange thing was, while some mocked him, others found faith through his story. They witnessed the truth. If a person like him, once ruthless, once hopeless, could be renewed, then anyone could. That was a clear testament to God's power. He not only forgives, but also transforms from the root. He not only washes away the stain, but also creates a completely new person. True transformation is not just about changing behavior. It is the renewal of the soul. And that inmate became a living testimony, a small but bright light in the darkness of the prison. When the prison gate closed behind me, I thought I was finally free. But after only a few days back in the outside world, I realized the truth was even more harsh. Outside, there were no iron bars, but there were probing eyes, subtle head shakes, and whispers full of prejudice. To many, I was still just a former convict, a shadow of the past. In the first few days, I felt like an outcast. Many job doors slammed in my face and old relationships distanced themselves. Loneliness came back, this time even more acutely, because I no longer had the iron bars to justify my isolation. I was in a community, but I didn't belong anywhere. It was in that emptiness that a small but precious door opened. A friend from church introduced me to a small group that supported former addicts, people who had fallen, and abandoned souls. At first I hesitated. I thought, what do I have to offer? I haven't even found my footing yet. How can I support others? But then a voice inside me said, go. I will use your scars to heal others. The first day I walked into the group meeting room, I was trembling. There I saw faces that were old before their time, eyes weary from sleepless nights, and bodies trembling from the haunting cravings of addiction. I looked at them and saw my old self, desperate, miserable, lost. Suddenly tears welled up. I no longer felt a distance. We were the same, people who had fallen but were longing for a chance to start over. I began to share my story. I talked about the darkness of prison, the nights filled with regret, and the first time I knelt and prayed through my tears. I told them about the light that touched my life, about the forgiveness and peace I had never known. In that moment, the room was silent. A few people bowed their heads and some eyes filled with tears. I understood that my story was not just a memory. It had become a bridge for other souls to walk out of the abyss. From that day on, I attended regularly. Every week we sat together and no one judged anyone. We shared our pain, supported each other through cravings and lonely nights. I learned to listen, something I had never done before. I listened to understand, to empathize, to give the other person the belief that they were not alone. And gradually I became the person that many of my brothers and sisters turned to when they were weak. Once, a man called me trembling in the middle of the night. "Brother, I can't take it anymore. I want to go back to drugs." I rushed to his house, sat by his side, prayed, and quietly sang a hymn until the craving passed. We cried together, but they were tears of release. I also began to get involved in social activities, going to rehabilitation centers, into poor neighborhoods where homeless children grew up in violence and hunger. I told them that the past doesn't determine the future, that darkness can never extinguish the light if we open our hearts to receive it. Some people called me a bearer of hope. When I heard that, I just bowed my head. I knew I was just a small instrument in his hands. Without grace, I would still be a forgotten prisoner. But that very grace had turned my life from a burden into a testimony. In that community, I was no longer an outcast. I was seen, loved, and given a chance. And most importantly, I could give back what I had received: love, forgiveness, and light. I remember one group meeting, a young man who had just been released from prison was huddled in a corner, not daring to look up. I saw in his eyes the same shame I once carried. I went and sat next to him, gently placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "You are not alone. I was there too. But trust me, there is another way, a way that leads to true freedom." That day he cried like a child, and I saw the darkness in his eyes gradually disappear. I realized that the community was not just a place where I came to be helped. It had become a place where I learned to give, where I turned my pain into strength, and where I saw more clearly than ever that his light was spreading. I once thought my freedom was the day I walked out of prison, But now I understand that true freedom came when I learned to live for others, when I dared to become a witness to love. From a despised person, I became a sower of hope, and it was on that journey that I found the deepest value of my life. The sound of the heavy iron door closing echoed in the dark hallway. The space of the four walls was still cramped and cold, and my solitary shadow still stretched long on the damp cement floor. But strangely, for the first time, I no longer felt fear or despair. I remember that moment, when the strange light pierced through the night of the solitary cell. It wasn't physical light, but the light of an invisible, yet very close presence. In the midst of my loneliness, I heard a whisper, "You have been forgiven. You belong to me." Those words were like invisible keys that unlocked every shackle, leading me out of the prison of sin, hatred, and torment. I realized that the real prison is not the four walls. The real prison is the chains in the soul, the resentment, the bitterness, the emptiness, and the despair. And true freedom is not about walking on wide roads, but when the spirit is set free to live in love and grace. From that day, I started to see everything with new eyes. The guard who once made me tremble was now a soul for whom I felt compassion. The noisy screams from other cells no longer irritated me, but became a reminder that so many people are still longing for the peace I had just found. And it was in the darkest place that I found the song of freedom. I hummed quietly. The melodies had no instruments, but they came from the depths of my heart. Each verse was a prayer, a declaration that I no longer belonged to the darkness. I belonged to the one who loved me, who came down to the bottom of the pit to pull me up. When I smiled in the solitary cell, I understood one thing for sure. True freedom can't be taken away by anyone.